Hello and welcome to Maximum Beck. It was written and researched by Martin Harper, music is by Damon Kirkham, and it's read by Sean Jones.
I was always the one trying to bring in more newer, modern, more mass-produced, contemporary stuff. I'm always interested in trying to get those kind of instruments to sound cool.
The music world has always attracted its fair share of truly unusual artists. Every generation produces certain people whose inspiration and creativity set them apart from their contemporaries. Sometimes these strange geniuses become musical legends, often cited as a great influence on later artists. Unfortunately, what often plagues such people is their failure to find success. Their unusual methods and occasionally difficult music prevent them from becoming popular amongst their contemporaries. Notorious eccentric Captain Beefheart spent many years being regarded as nothing more than an exceptionally strange person. In recent decades, he has been acknowledged as the definitive creative influence on a wide variety of artists, from the Red Hot Chili Peppers to Green Day. The one notable exception of this rule is Frank Zappa, whose work sold well and was critically respected for much of his career. But he is a rarity amongst thousands of artists whose music has been largely forgotten. In recent years, there has been much more variety in the music world, and many forms of music that would once have been ignored have now found an audience. Even so, it is still difficult to achieve a high level of success unless you have an openly commercial sound. This is a self-perpetuating situation. The public rarely hears truly different artists because they are seldom signed by major labels. In turn, the major labels ignore such acts because they think the record-buying public will not be interested. Occasionally, the circle breaks, and one of the larger record companies takes the risk of signing up an artist whose commercial success is uncertain, not to mention highly unlikely. More often, they wait for a sign. This is the kind of opportunity that threw Beck Hansen into the spotlight. The startling popularity of a limited edition 12-inch single on an independent record label aroused the interest of a number of major companies. Even though his music was strange and obscure in places, the attention of the public was captured, and Beck became the most unlikely superstar of the 90s. Against the odds, someone who had always believed his music to be too different for commercial success was suddenly an overnight sensation. Beck's career does not reflect a life of glamour and Hollywood glitter. Despite his popularity, he has resisted the urge to slip into the mainstream. Behind the artist, there is still the teenager who flicked through his mother's record collection and struggled hard to make a living from reciting poetry and playing guitar on the street corners of Los Angeles.
It's pretty easy to plug in something from the early 70s and it's oh, it's great, you've heard it on a million records before. I think it's kind of interesting to take something that hasn't been really used.
Beck was born Beck David Campbell at 1 minute before midnight on July the 7th, 1970. As a child, he divided his time between Kansas, where he was born, and Los Angeles. Beck's parents had divorced when he was 3, and his mother moved to California. His father, David Campbell, was a former bluegrass musician who now made his living as a string arranger and producer. He is a well-known figure on the California music scene, and he has added strings to albums by many bands, including Aerosmith, Cracker, and Green Day. Working constantly, he was rarely able to look after Beck himself, and when his son came to stay with him in Kansas, he lived with his paternal grandfather, a local minister. Although this upbringing was not harsh, Beck was expected to appreciate and follow his grandfather's religious lifestyle. Understandably, he became more and more disillusioned with his father's continued absence, and eventually chose to live in Los Angeles permanently. The two sides of the family came from very different worlds. Beck's maternal grandfather was a well-known performance artist who had made a name for himself in the 60s with his stage shows and eccentric acts. One of his more publicised performances involved pushing a piano out of a very high window. Although not as active as he used to be, Al Hansen remained an important member of the fringe art culture. Al's daughter, Beck's mother, had her own claims to fame. Throughout the late 60s, Bib Hansen had been a follower of Andy Warhol, who had featured the younger actress in a number of his films and stage shows. Although not famous by Hollywood standards, Bib's experiences and Warhol's reputation ensured that she found plenty of work on the same fringe circuit that supported her father. When she divorced from David Campbell, Bib retired from acting and performance art and opened a string of cafes instead. She soon became a supporter of the growing Los Angeles punk scene and allowed her cafes to be used as the focus of the local alternative set. Beck himself was a quiet and studious child. Despite being exposed to punk music from an early age, his musical tastes lay elsewhere, and the folktales and ballads of Woody Guthrie interested him more. Aside from American folk, he developed a passion for the early Mississippi Delta blues artists from the turn of the century. The raw and loose feel to these recordings would prove a great influence on his own songs, as Beck sought to recapture that raw sound with the aid of modern technology. As a child, Beck's musical development was guided by his mother's record collection. Over the years, Bib Hansen had acquired a large number of rare recordings and albums, some of which had never been played. Eagerly searching through the vinyl, Beck discovered that much was to his liking. Many of the old folk singers and blues musicians would be rediscovered in the 80s and 90s, but for now, all that existed was one-off pressings from 20 or 30 years before. He took these albums and listened to them as often as possible, occasionally finding things even his mother did not realise she owned. As with many teenagers, Beck's first creative outlet was not music, but poetry. Modelling his work on the stream of consciousness writings of the beat poets, as well as folk ballads, Beck first performed in the Los Angeles cafes. Not long after first experimenting with poetry, he took up the guitar and soon began accompanying himself, as his poems slowly became folk songs, highly influenced by his hero Woody Guthrie. Although Beck found little in punk that interested him musically, he did admire the attitude behind it. The idea that you did not have to master your instrument to make a living appealed to him greatly. Taking his cue from the bands who could only manage a few chords but still played as much as they could, Beck took his guitar and began busking around the streets of Los Angeles, earning him some much-needed cash at the same time. The experience allowed his confidence to grow until performance became natural and easy. Academically, Beck was a good student, but despite this, he had no desire to attend college. Allowed to leave school at the age of 14, he devoted much of his time to playing and performing, and for the next 2 years he made his living from busking and poetry readings. Beck's acoustic guitar-based songs were not always popular in Los Angeles, as mainstream Californians in the mid-80s were mainly listening to the spandex-wearing, peroxide blonde rock bands like Poison and Rat. The alternative scene was mostly concerned with a new wave of punk. In between the hairspray and political anger, there wasn't much room for Beck's brand of mellow, folk-influenced songwriting. Suspecting that his career would not progress whilst he remained in Los Angeles, Beck looked at the possibility of moving elsewhere. Still only 18, he decided to leave for the East Coast. The art scene in New York was very different, and at the time, a whole new wave of folk music was becoming popular. These new artists rejected the way folk had progressed in the 70s in favour of a more basic approach, harking back to the singers of the Great Depression. This back-to-the-roots mentality impressed the young Beck, who quickly booked a bus ticket and headed to the other side of the country.
I don't know what you have to do to be hip-hop. All I know is that whenever I try to do something, someone's, that ain't hip-hop.
Beck arrived in New York in late 1989. He slipped easily into the lifestyle of the Lower East Side, where the new folk movement was based. He found no difficulty in finding venues and appreciative audiences, as well as a large number of like-minded people. Sensing that he had finally found the best place to be, Beck began building up his career. Unfortunately, his instincts proved to be wrong in this case. Certainly the anti-folk scene, as it had become known, was flourishing. This was, in fact, part of the problem. There were new folk singers everywhere. Almost every bar and club regularly featured someone with an acoustic guitar and a handful of self-penned songs. Beck was lost in this atmosphere, indistinguishable from 1,000 similar artists who had all come to the big city to make their living, just like Beck. Without knowing it, this would prove to be the downfall of the New York folk scene. Audiences soon became tired of hearing the same kind of thing over and over again and lost interest. Any major record companies that were interested allowed themselves to be guided by fashion and stopped looking for the next folk hero. After living in New York for just over a year, Beck had little to show for all his hard work. Disillusioned with his experiences of the music world, he decided to return to California. Even though his brand of music still wasn't particularly popular in Los Angeles, at least he was unique. Refusing to give up, he began working in a video store, while securing gigs anywhere he could. He realised that the punk clubs would be his best choice of venue, and slowly worked his way round the area, begging club owners and managers to let him have some time on stage. He also appeared regularly at the Café Troy, which was owned by his mother. In later years, Beck would become known for his experimental music style. The roots of this innovative approach can be found in the months following his return to Los Angeles. Using what little money he could scrape together, he bought a cheap 4-track recorder and slowly teaching himself the basics of recording, he began to assemble a collection of songs. The opportunities provided by 4-track recording proved to be the perfect creative spur for Beck. Over the recent months, he had become frustrated by the limitations of one guitar. But with the aid of his 4-track recorder, he would come a little closer to fully creating the ideas he had in his head. Although the first attempts were simplistic and rough, they contained the seed of what was to come later. Meanwhile, Beck's music was slowly growing more popular. His cafe appearances were well attended, and he was becoming a popular opening act for more famous bands. He had even found a musical partner. Martha Atwell was a singer who shared many of the same tastes as Beck, with a similar preference for the Delta blues musicians. Together, they worked under the name 10 Ton Lid, with each of them providing vocal accompaniment to Beck's guitar. The duo took to performing as often as possible, and this would be an essential step in Beck's career. Slowly growing more adventurous, he began to experiment further with the recording process. Before long, the 4-track recorder became a regular addition to the stage performance, with the live instruments recorded onto existing tracks. Martha and Beck added their vocals, creating the illusion of a number of musicians. Eventually, the pair dropped their simple guitars and vocals format in favour of this more modern approach. Many of the small independent record labels used the underground scene in Los Angeles to recruit new acts. Essentially, they were able to pick and choose, because most of the bands they dealt with were seen as being far too eccentric or alternative to attract the major labels. Certainly, corporations such as Capitol or Warner Brothers were very reluctant to sign artists who were either not well known already or just about to become popular. In this climate, most bands thought it was better to sign with a small label and get an album out than it was to hang around and wait for the major labels to take interest. There were advantages to this situation. The independent labels were not necessarily concerned with who would sell the most records, but more with allowing smaller bands the chance to get their careers off the ground. They were frequently more helpful than the larger companies. One such independent label was Bong Load Custom Records, run by a man named Tom Rothrock. Like many of his peers, Rothrock spent a lot of time at clubs and cafes. checking out the underground and alternative acts, and in early 1993 he attended a 10-ton lid show. Immediately impressed by Beck's direction, he resolved to help the young musician. One of Rothrock's many acquaintances was Carl Stevenson, a local producer. Although Stevenson usually worked with hip-hop acts, Rothrock spotted the similarities between Beck's experimentation and the cut-and-paste approach favoured by the hip-hop culture. He quickly arranged for the pair to meet. Beck and Stevenson quickly became friends. For the producer, it was a chance to work with someone who possessed a genuinely different artistic vision. More importantly, he had the ability to help Beck realise that vision. Despite his years of experimentation, Beck did not have access to the equipment or technical knowledge that would allow him to progress. In Stevenson, he had found someone who could provide everything that he needed.
We felt we had to go the extra dimension, 4 dimensions. I think 3 has been done. It's sort of passé, and this is the dawning of a new age.
Beck and Stevenson spent the summer of 1993 recording, and within a few months the pair had prepared a large number of completed songs, which covered a wide variety of styles. Some of them reflected Beck's long-standing love of folk music, whilst others showed a more contemporary influence. Only one of the tracks from those early sessions would become famous, and bizarrely, it was the one that had caused Beck difficulty during the recordings. The backing track had been prepared by Stevenson, who had sampled parts of a 60s hit by New Orleans jazzman Dr. John. Beck had created a lazy slide guitar riff, but had increasing problems with the vocals. In the end, he simply recorded a rambling, meaningless set of verses in a rap style. But when he arrived at the chorus, he had no lyrics prepared. Frustrated, he just sang, "I'm a loser, baby, so why don't you kill me?" Instead of scrapping the version as another failure, Stevenson left the tapes rolling and motioned for Beck to carry on. The song was eventually called Loser. What had been the singer's expression of frustration became the chorus to his most popular hit. The pair later played the song to Tom Rothrock, who agreed to publish it on his Bongload custom records. The single would appear in both 7-inch and 12-inch versions, with 1,500 copies being produced. This was simply intended to be enough to send out to local radio stations and attract Beck a little more publicity. More effort was put into the other recordings made that summer, and 2 further releases were prepared, also on independent labels. Beck would continue to deal with small, non-commercial labels long after he was a household name. The first of the other releases was a cassette-only album entitled Golden Feelings. The second was called A Western Harvest Field by Moonlight and appeared on 10-inch vinyl only. This last recording displayed Beck's folk roots and made little use of the technology he had recently discovered. Neither of these records sold well, mainly because they were not produced in a large enough quantity. In the light of Beck's success, they have been frequently bootlegged, with copies fetching a handsome price, which does not necessarily reflect their quality. After these sessions, Beck returned to playing live. Selling the recordings at shows made him a little extra cash and allowed his music to spread further. Unknown to him, the limited edition pressings of Loser were doing far more for his career than all his live performances and independent albums put together. Unexpectedly, the Los Angeles radio stations had loved the song and played it regularly. Although not a mainstream favourite, it proved popular with the alternative radio slots. Thankfully, a scout from one of the biggest record labels in the country was listening. Tom Berg worked for Geffen Records, a label famous for producing the world's biggest rock bands. Chief executive David Geffen had a reputation for being an astute businessman who took risks that usually paid off. Sensing that Beck had potential to become very popular, Berg passed on copies of Loser to as many radio stations as he could. Before long, the track could be heard in New York, Seattle, and all over Los Angeles. The response was the same across the country. Loser was an instant favourite. Unfortunately, this is where the limitations of the independent labels manifested themselves. No matter how popular Loser was, Bongload Custom Records did not have the facilities or capital to produce a single and distribute it in 3 major cities, let alone across the country. Those first pressings had only been intended for sale in Los Angeles. The backing of a major record label would be needed before Beck could reap any rewards. Thankfully, the airplay that Loser gained ensured that major companies were definitely interested. Despite the unorthodox sound of the record, the constant request for the song to be played suggested that Beck would be worth signing, and a number of record labels began making offers to the young singer, eager to get hold of him before any of the others. Wisely, Beck chose to listen to all of them, rather than accepting the first offer to come along. This resulted in a bidding war between 3 of the largest record labels in the world. Geffen Records had already expressed an interest, and now Capitol and Warner Brothers put forward offers too. For Beck, this situation became increasingly confusing as each label raised their bid. Eventually, David Geffen intervened personally. This was something he had done before. If his lawyers could not attract an artist he was keen to sign, he would make a personal appearance in an effort to sway them. In Beck's case, Geffen chose to phone him and discuss terms that way. Impressed by his concern, as well as the contract he was offered, Beck agreed to sign a deal with Geffen Records. Now, he had definitely come out on top. On one level, he had the backing of an extremely wealthy and influential label for 3 albums. In addition, he was also free to release as much work on independent labels as he wished. Although this situation would later break down, for now it seemed that Beck was in an enviable position.
Their shows are much more energy driven.
1994 began well for Beck. He had already begun assembling the material that would become his major label debut album. With increased publicity, Loser was becoming more and more popular, and now he had secured an incredible deal with Geffen Records. So far, he had done relatively little work, but was acquiring a good reputation nonetheless. Beck's first release since signing to Geffen, Loser, entered the US modern rock chart at number 1 and remained there for 5 weeks. 1 month later, it would enter the UK top 20 and would eventually climb into the American national top 10. Even before it reached its peak, Loser would earn Beck his first gold record. One of the success stories of the year, the single has remained a regular radio favourite across the world. Whilst his debut single climbed charts worldwide, Beck entered the busiest period of his career so far. Despite having handed over the tapes for his first album, he also prepared 2 further recordings for release on independent labels. The album for Geffen was called Mellow Gold and was released in March to incredible critical response. Beck was quickly heralded as the latest musical genius, as well as the spokesman for the younger generation. Loser was transformed into an anthem for dissatisfied youths, and its ironic chorus became a popular slacker refrain. Beck himself protested that the song was nothing to do with any popular movement of the time. Unfortunately, the label stuck, and Beck would be known for years as an icon for disaffected teenagers. This idea even extended to his clothing. His dismissal of fashion and preference for cheaper clothing was picked up on and blown out of proportion. In reality, Beck's dress sense was dictated by many years of living cheaply and a conscious desire not to waste the money he was making now by buying expensive clothing. Mellow Gold itself is a sprawling work. It takes in all of Beck's influences, ranging from folk to funk, from punk to soul. Embracing sampling wholeheartedly, the songs frequently have many different layers, creating a sometimes uncomfortable sound. Certain songs are very peaceful and simplistic, whilst others are hectic and complicated. Beck's early love of folk is obvious, but there are so many other things happening that the album cannot really be described as a collection of folk-influenced songs. This is perhaps the greatest flaw. There is so much variety on Mellow Gold that the listener quickly tires of the endless jumps from one style to another. However, Beck could easily have followed just 10 or 12 repeats of the format of Loser, which remains the best song on the album. The other two records from 1994 were patchy affairs. The contract with Geffen stated that Beck was free to release anything they felt would not be a commercial success, as long as he limited them to independent labels. In retrospect, it is easy to see why they were only interested in Mellow Gold. The second release was called Stereopathetic Soul Manure, and is a noisy, disjointed album. Essentially, it is nothing more than a series of musical experiments that rarely follow traditional ideas of what makes up a song. The third, One Foot in the Grave, is an uninspired collection of simple folk songs. Containing none of the elements that make Beck's later work stand out, these two albums are for hardcore fans only. Although very different to his major label debut, Beck's independent releases were snapped up by his growing following, although it is unlikely that they were particularly impressed. Understandably, they sold well, but nowhere near the level of Mellow Gold and his subsequent albums. Mellow Gold followed closely behind Loser in terms of sales. By the time Beck embarked on his first nationwide series of concerts, the single had sold 500,000 copies, and the album would reach the same level by the end of the year. The concerts themselves proved to be troublesome for Beck. For a start, he wasn't sure how he would perform the material on stage, given that so much of it was based upon samples and a large amount of technology. Having written the album almost entirely single-handed, Beck did not have a studio band to fall back on, and eventually he settled for a compromise between the two. An on-stage DJ would handle some of the sampled parts, while most of the instrumentation would be played by a live band. A group of session musicians was quickly recruited, and Beck himself would handle some of the guitar lines and most of the vocals. The new band set off on the road just as Loser hit its US peak. The shows went well, although it was obvious that Beck himself was uncomfortable with live performances. The famous venues and the big audiences were a far cry from simple shows in Los Angeles coffee bars, and the singer often found it difficult to handle. Although the band were all excellent musicians in their own right, the lack of experience with the material led to occasionally poor renditions, which depressed Beck further. Despite these early problems, the band struggled on, and the reviews were mostly positive. The only negative criticism they received concerned Beck's songwriting. Some reviewers felt that the songs from Mellow Gold were mostly unsuited to live performance and did not translate well. Undoubtedly, there was some truth in this. Beck's songs were written and created by one or two men in a studio, rather than a band in a rehearsal hall. Beck learnt from these experiences and used them to his advantage when recording and touring in the future. Although the young singer felt he had reached his peak already, in later years his fame and success would grow well beyond his expectations.